You are listening to Craziest HOA Moments. I wish this was exaggerated. I am a network engineer, and I moved to Rochester, New York because the job market here is solid and the cost of living beats most of the Northeast. The Clearbrook Ridge Association runs my neighborhood, and they treat every curb like a war zone. I have been here 6 months, and I have already seen 3 cars booted, 2 towed, and 1 guy fined $800 because his guest parked nose in instead of back in. My license depends on staying out of legal trouble, so when the board started targeting me, I knew I had to be careful. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday afternoon when a rideshare driver pulled up to my curb to wait for a passenger, and Kathleen Carter, the community standards chair, tried to tow them for idling. I was standing in my driveway when she appeared, holding a boot clamp key like it was a scepter. She waved it at the driver and said, "You are in violation of the fire lane protocol. I am calling the tow company." The driver looked at me, confused, and I said, "This is not a fire lane." She smiled and said, "Smile, I am documenting this for the file." She pulled out her phone and started filming the car. I walked over and said, "Show me the fire lane marking." She said, "It does not need a marking if the board designates it verbally." I said, "That is not how fire lanes work." She said, "Keep arguing. You are making my case for me." The driver left before the tow truck arrived, but Kathleen stayed on my curb for another 10 minutes, taking photos of my driveway, my guest parking permit decal on my windshield, and the angle of my car in the space. I knew right then that she was building a file. 2 days later, I got a parking violation notice taped to my front door. It read like a ransom note with a deadline that made no sense. It said I had 72 hours to produce proof of compliance or my vehicle would be subject to towing and booting at owner expense. It did not specify what compliance meant. I called the HOA office and got voicemail. I emailed the board and got an auto reply. I texted my property manager friend Luis, who has worked with HOAs for 15 years, and he said, "They are inventing permits that do not exist, then daring you to prove otherwise." He told me to start keeping an invoice trail showing favoritism tied to their preferred tow vendor. He said, "If they are selective, that is your leverage." I spent the next week documenting everything. I photographed every car on every street. I noted which ones had permits, which ones did not, and which ones were parked in ways that should have triggered a violation but did not. I found 8 cars without decals that had been sitting for days, untouched. I found 2 cars parked across fire hydrants that never got a notice. I found 1 car blocking a mailbox cluster, and it belonged to a board member. I saved all of it in a folder on my phone, and I kept a folded tow yard receipt packet in a sleeve in my jacket pocket, just in case I needed to look prepared. Luis told me, "You are not ready to win yet, but you are getting there." On Friday, Kathleen came back. She had a tow truck behind her, and she was holding a clipboard. She knocked on my door and said, "Your permit decal is not valid because it is slightly crooked." I said, "That is not in the rules." She said, "It is in the enforcement guidelines." I said, "Show me the guidelines." She said, "They are internal." I said, "Then they do not exist." She said, "Smile, I am documenting this for the file." She took a photo of my windshield, then turned to the tow driver and said, "Boot this vehicle." The driver looked at her, then looked at me and said, "I need to see the authorization." She handed him a slip of paper, and he read it for a long moment, then looked back at her and said, "This does not have a signature." She said, "It has my signature." He said, "It is supposed to have a board signature." She said, "I am the board." He said, "That is not how it works." He folded the slip and handed it back to her, then got back in his truck and left. Kathleen stood there, staring at me and said, "This is not over." That night, I got an attorney letter in my mailbox. It was full of bluff language meant to scare me into paying instantly. It said I owed $300 in fines for permit non-compliance, guest parking violations, and obstruction of HOA enforcement. It said if I did not pay within 5 business days, the amount would increase to $600 and my vehicle would be towed. It did not cite any specific rule. I called Luis and read it to him. He said that is a shakedown. They are betting you will panic and pay. I said, what do I do? He said, you file a complaint with the State Consumer Protection Office and you document every single interaction. He said, and you stop reacting. You let her dig. I nodded like I was losing, because I wanted her to get comfortable. I filed the complaint on Monday. I included the notice, the letter, the photos of selective enforcement, and a timeline of every interaction with Kathleen. I included the invoice trail showing favoritism tied to the preferred tow vendor. I included the forged tow authorization signature, because when I compared it to the board president's signature on a prior HOA letter, the handwriting was obviously different. I included a roll of chalk marks on tires that Kathleen treated like evidence, even though chalk marking is illegal in New York without a posted regulation. I sent everything to the Consumer Protection Office and asked for a case file number. They gave me one, and I wrote it down on the back of my tow yard receipt packet. The next day, my guest pass expired. I had a visitor coming that night and I needed to renew it. I went to the HOA office and Kathleen was there. She said, you need to fill out a new form. I said, fine. She handed me a form and I filled it out. She looked at it and said, this is incomplete. I said, what is missing? She said, you did not list the vehicle make. I said, yes, I did. She said, you did not list the vehicle color. I said, yes, I did. She said, you did not sign it. I said, I signed it right here. She said, that is not a valid signature. I said, what does that mean? She said, it is not legible. I said, it is my signature. She said, I am denying this application. I said, on what grounds? She said, non-compliance. I said, that is not a reason. She said, keep arguing. You are making my case for me. She tore up the form and dropped it in the trash. I stood there, staring at her, and said, you are betting on the clock, are not you? She smiled and said, your guest pass expires tonight. I walked out. I called Luis and told him what happened. He said, she is trying to provoke you into doing something stupid. Do not take the bait. I said, my guest is coming in 3 hours. He said, park your guest on the street outside the subdivision. I said, the street parking ban says I cannot do that after 6. He said, then park them in your driveway and dare her to tow. I said, she will. He said, good. Let her. You want her on record committing the violation. I said, what if she wins? He said, she will not. You have the case file. You have the handwriting comparison. You have the invoice trail. You have the chalk marks. You have everything. Just do not lose your temper. My guest arrived at 7. I parked them in my driveway nose in with the guest pass visible on the dashboard even though Kathleen had denied it. I went inside and waited. At 7:30 I heard a diesel engine. I looked out the window and saw a tow truck backing into my driveway. Kathleen was standing on the curb holding her clipboard. The tow driver got out and started attaching the wheel lift to my guest's car. I grabbed my jacket and my receipt packet and walked outside. I said, what are you doing? Kathleen said, this vehicle is in violation of guest parking protocol. I said, I have a guest pass. She said, your application was denied. I said, you denied it illegally. She said, that is your opinion. I said, no, that is the law. She said, smile, I am documenting this for the file. She held up her phone and started filming. The tow driver looked at me and said, do you have authorization for this vehicle to be here? I said, yes. He said, can I see it? I pulled out the folded receipt packet and handed it to him. He opened it and looked at the case file number written on the back. He said, what is this? I said, that is a state consumer protection complaint confirmation showing prior enforcement complaints against the HOA. He looked at Kathleen and said, you did not tell me there was a complaint. She said, that is irrelevant. He said, no, it is not. He pulled out his phone and called his boss. He put it on speaker. The tow company owner answered and said, "What is it?" The driver said, "I am on a call at Clearbrook Ridge, and the property owner is saying there is a state complaint." The owner said, "Is that the same address we got flagged on last month?" The driver said, "Yeah." The owner said, "Stop the tow." The driver said, "The HOA rep is saying she has authorization." The owner said, "I do not care. If there is a complaint, we do not touch it. Tell her to call the office." The driver hung up and looked at Kathleen. He said, "I am not towing this car." She said, "You have to." He said, "No, I do not." She said, "I am the community standards chair." He said, "That does not mean anything to me." She said, "I will report you." He said, "Go ahead." He unhooked the wheel lift and got back in his truck. Kathleen stood there staring at him and said, "This is obstruction." He said, "No, this is me doing my job." He drove off. Kathleen turned to me and said, "You think you won?" I said, "I quoted your own words back to you. Keep arguing. You are making my case for me." Her face went red. She said, "I am filing a formal complaint with the board." I said, "Good. I will see you at the hearing." If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and I spent that time building my case. Luis helped me organize everything into a clean packet. We included the invoice trail showing favoritism, the handwriting comparison proving Kathleen forged the tow authorization signature, the photos of selective enforcement, the chalk marks, the denied guest pass application, the attorney letter, and the complaint confirmation. We also included a timeline of every interaction, with dates, times, and witnesses. Luis said, "You want the board to see that this is a pattern, not a one-time thing." I said, "What if they side with her?" He said, "They will not. You have the state involved now. They are going to panic." On the day of the hearing, I arrived early. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, and the board was already seated. Kathleen was there, sitting at the end of the table, looking smug. The board president opened the meeting and said, "We are here to discuss a complaint filed by a resident regarding enforcement actions taken by the community standards chair." He looked at me and said, "You have 5 minutes to present your case." I stood up and handed the officer on scene a clean packet and asked for an incident number. He gave me one and I wrote it on the top of the first page. I said, "This is a management audit that exposes the pattern of selective enforcement and illegal towing practices carried out by the community standards chair." I walked through every piece of evidence. I showed the invoice trail. I showed the handwriting comparison. I showed the photos of cars that were not ticketed. I showed the chalk marks. I showed the denied guest pass application. I showed the attorney letter. I showed the complaint confirmation. I said, "Kathleen Carter has used her position to harass residents, forge tow authorizations, and collect fees for a preferred vendor. She has violated state consumer protection law, and she has created liability for this association." I sat down. Kathleen stood up and said, "This is a fabrication." I said, "Then explain the handwriting." She said, "I signed that authorization on behalf of the board." I said, "You are not authorized to do that." She said, "I am the community standards chair." I said, "That does not give you signature authority." The board president said, "Is that true?" She said, "It is implied." He said, "No, it is not." She said, "I was acting in the best interest of the community." He said, "You were acting on your own." She said, "I was enforcing the rules." He said, "You were making up the rules." She said, "That is not true." I stood up and said, "You told me my permit decal was not valid because it was slightly crooked. You told me I needed permits that do not exist. You told the tow driver that fire lanes can be designated verbally. You told me my signature was not legible. You told me guest parking protocol required board approval for every visitor. None of that is in the rules." Kathleen said, "It is in the enforcement guidelines." I said, "Show me the enforcement guidelines." She said, "They are internal." I said, "They do not exist." The board president said, "Do we have enforcement guidelines?" The board treasurer said no. The board secretary said no. Kathleen said, "I have been using discretion." The board president said, "You have been using your own rules." The board went into closed session for 20 minutes. When they came back, the board president said, "The board has voted to suspend enforcement actions pending a full review." He looked at Kathleen and said, "You are removed from your position as Community Standards Chair, effective immediately." Kathleen said, "You cannot do that." He said, "We just did." She said, "I will sue." He said, "You are welcome to try." She stood up and walked out, slamming the door behind her. The board president looked at me and said, "We apologize for the inconvenience. We will be conducting a management audit to ensure compliance with state law going forward." I said, "Thank you." He said, "The fines will be reversed, and the guest pass application will be approved." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "Is there anything else?" I said, "Yes. I want the chalk marking policy clarified in writing." He said, "We will take care of that." I walked out. 2 days later, I got a call from the State Consumer Protection Office. They said the case file had been escalated to an investigation. They said they had received multiple complaints about the Clearbrook Ridge Association, and they were opening a formal inquiry into towing practices, fee structures, and board governance. They said the HOA had already contacted them to request a settlement. I said, "What does that mean?" They said, "It means they want to avoid a public hearing." I said, "What do I need to do?" They said, "Nothing. We will handle it." They said the settlement would likely include policy changes, refunds, and penalties. They said Kathleen would be required to resign from all leadership roles in the association. I said, "Good." They said, "We will keep you updated." I hung up. That weekend, I was working in my garage when Louis stopped by. He said, "I heard the board is freaking out." I said, "Good." He said, "They are talking about replacing the entire tow vendor contract." I said, "They should." He said, "They are also talking about hiring a compliance officer to review all enforcement actions before they go out." I said, "That is a smart move." He said, "You did a good thing." I said, "I just wanted them to follow their own rules." He said, "That is all it takes." I said, "I wish it did not take a state investigation to get there." He said, "Sometimes it does." He said, "You should run for the board." I laughed and said, "No thanks." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I have better things to do than spend my evenings arguing about parking spaces." He said, "Fair enough." He said, "But if you change your mind, I will nominate you." I said, "I will keep that in mind." A month later, the state released their findings. The report was public, and it was brutal. It found that the Clearbrook Ridge Association had engaged in selective enforcement, illegal fee collection, unauthorized towing, and fraudulent documentation. It found that Kathleen had forged multiple tow authorizations, that the preferred tow vendor had received kickbacks, and that the board had failed to oversee enforcement actions. The report recommended policy changes, refunds, and penalties. The HOA rushed to settle. They refunded every fine issued under Kathleen's watch. They terminated the contract with the preferred tow vendor. They adopted a new enforcement policy that required board approval for all towing actions. They hired a compliance officer to review all notices before they went out. And they required Kathleen to resign from every leadership role in the association. The settlement also required the HOA to send a letter to every resident explaining the changes and apologizing for the enforcement actions. I got my copy in the mail on a Tuesday, and I read it twice. It was short and it was careful, but it was an apology. I folded it and put it in the receipt packet. The next week, I saw Kathleen at the mailbox cluster. She did not look at me. She pulled her mail out of the box and walked back to her house without a word. I watched her go, and I thought about all the times she had stood on my curb, holding her phone, telling me to smile because she was documenting it for the file. I thought about the tow driver who called his boss on speaker and refused to hook my guest's car. I thought about the board president telling her she was removed and the door slamming behind her. I thought about the state report and the settlement and the refunds. I thought about the invoice trail and the handwriting comparison and the chalk marks and the complaint confirmation. I thought about Louise telling me to let her dig. And I thought about how she tried to shame me and the neighbor fact-checked her instantly. That was the funny karma beat. She spent months building a case against me, and in the end, she built a case against herself. I went back inside and opened my laptop. I had an email from the Consumer Protection Office. It said the case was officially closed, and the settlement had been finalized. It said the HOA stops selective enforcement after complaints pile up, and it said the policy changes were now in effect. It said if I had any further issues, I should contact them immediately. I replied and said thank you. I closed the laptop and sat back. I thought about the first day Kathleen came to my curb, waving her boot clamp key and telling the rideshare driver they were in violation. I thought about the parking violation notice with the deadline that made no sense. I thought about the attorney letter full of bluff language. I thought about the denied guest pass application. I thought about the tow truck backing into my driveway. I thought about the driver calling his boss on speaker. I thought about Kathleen's bluff getting read out loud and the room reacting. That was the consequence. She bet on the clock, and she bet on fear, and she lost both. I ran into Luis a few days later at the grocery store. He said, "Did you see the new signs?" I said, "What signs?" He said the HOA put up new parking signs with actual regulations. I said, "Good." He said they also posted the enforcement policy on the website. I said, "Even better." He said, "And they fired the old tow vendor." I said, "I heard." He said, "The new vendor is local, and they have a good reputation." I said, "That is what they should have done in the first place." He said, "You did this." I said, "I just filed a complaint." He said, "You did more than that. You held them accountable." I said, "Someone had to." He said, "Most people would have paid the fine and moved on." I said I could not. My license depends on staying out of legal trouble. I said if I paid a bogus fine, it would have been on record. I said I could not let that happen. He said, "I get it." He said, "You did the right thing." I said, "I hope so." He said, "You did. Trust me." We checked out and walked to the parking lot. He said, "So are you going to run for the board?" I said no. He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I already spent 6 months fighting them. I do not want to spend the next 3 years fixing them." He laughed and said, "Fair enough." He said, "But if you change your mind, the nomination window opens next month." I said, "I will keep that in mind." He said, "Good." He got in his car and drove off. I drove home and parked in my driveway. My guest permit decal was still on the windshield, slightly crooked, and I left it that way. I walked inside and made dinner. I ate on the couch and watched the news. The local segment ran a story about HOA reform efforts across the state. They mentioned the Clearbrook Ridge case by name. They said the State Consumer Protection Office was using it as a model for enforcement best practices. They said other HOAs were now required to adopt similar transparency policies. They said the case had sparked a wave of complaints against other associations. I turned off the TV and sat in the quiet. I thought about the tow operator standing back and listening carefully while Kathleen threatened him. I thought about the moment he called his boss on speaker and everything flipped. I thought about the board president telling her she was removed. I thought about the state report and the settlement and the apology letter. I thought about the refunds and the policy changes and the new signs. I thought about the traffic cone stack strapped down on the tow bed, still sitting there when the driver pulled away. I thought about how a management audit exposed the pattern, and how the system finally worked the way it was supposed to. And I thought about how Kathleen's bluff got read out loud, and the room reacted. That was the payoff. That was the justice. That was the reason I kept the receipt packet folded in my jacket, just in case. I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in months. The next morning, I got up and went to work. I logged into the network, ran my diagnostics, and started my shift. Everything was normal. Everything was quiet. And for the first time since I moved to Rochester, I did not have to worry about a tow truck showing up in my driveway. I did not have to worry about a boot clamp on my wheel. I did not have to worry about a violation notice taped to my door. I did not have to worry about Kathleen standing on my curb, filming me, telling me to smile. I did not have to worry about any of it. Because the State Consumer Protection Office opened a case file, the HOA rushed to settle, and Kathleen was forced to resign from every leadership role. That was the outcome. That was the end. And that was exactly what I wanted. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.